I'm Loretta Simmons, and I stopped trying to explain myself years ago. Somewhere between the laughter that never included me and the silences that said too much, something inside me went quiet. Permanently. My sister, Marianne, had a way of turning every memory into proof that I'd failed her, failed the family, failed at being what they understood. That night, when she laughed at me across the dinner table, loud enough for everyone to hear, soft enough to sound innocent, I realized how long I'd been standing in that same spot, taking the same hits, pretending they didn't land. I'd spent years swallowing words sharper than glass, convincing myself that grace meant staying silent. But silence doesn't heal when it's mistaken for weakness. As I watched her raise her glass, smiling like she'd won something I never even competed for, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that peace and surrender were the same thing, so I let the moment settle. And in that stillness, I made a promise, quiet, steady, and certain. They would never see me the same way again. The front door gave a long, familiar groan when I pushed it open, the kind that used to mean home. The smell of cinnamon, baked ham, and pine rushed out first, almost convincing me that time hadn't moved. But it had. Everything looked the same, too much the same, and that, somehow, made it worse. Marianne's voice filled the hallway before I even stepped in. She was calling out instructions, telling her husband where to put the cider, telling the kids not to touch the pies, making sure every detail performed on cue. She turned when she saw me, the quick flash of a smile followed by an equally quick glance from my hair to my shoes. The hug was polite, practiced. I could almost feel her mind already moving to the next checklist item. The house glowed in warm light, golden against the snow pressing against the windows. Every corner was staged like a Christmas card. Too perfect, too deliberate. Marianne had always believed that appearances were proof of happiness. I used to envy that certainty. Now I just found it exhausting. My father sat near the fireplace, half shadowed by the flicker of the flames, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he folded the evening paper. When our eyes met, he gave me a nod, one of those small, wordless gestures that carried more truth than any hug. He didn't need to say he was glad I was home. He'd already said it with that look. I hung my coat on the rack, boots still damp with melted snow, and for a moment I hesitated, between stepping into the room or turning back out into the cold. Then Marianne called from the dining table, her voice bright and smooth like lacquer. "Come on, Loretta, dinner's getting cold." The long oak table shimmered under the chandelier. Silverware gleamed, wine glasses sparkled. Everyone had a story ready to tell. New jobs, ski trips, promotions, college acceptances. The noise was steady and confident, each person certain of their place in this small, shining ecosystem. I sat down between my cousin Ethan and Aunt Clara, neither of whom seemed sure what to say to me. It didn't matter. I'd gotten used to the pauses that followed my presence. As I listened, I realized that almost nothing in the room had changed, except me. The chairs were still the same maple set from when Mom hosted these dinners. The same embroidered napkins, the same scent of her spiced candles that Marianne still burned every December. But the warmth I remembered had cooled into something more fragile, something you could break just by breathing too loud. When the conversation circled to me, I opened my mouth to mention the flying program I ran in Missoula. Before I could finish the first sentence, Marianne leaned forward, eyes bright. "Loretta's always been the one who picks the road less traveled," she said, laughing lightly. Even when no one else wants to go that way." Laughter rippled around the table, polite, harmless on the surface, but I felt the sting under it. I smiled back, because that's what you do when you've run out of energy to explain yourself. They went back to their stories, and I faded into the background again. It wasn't cruel, just careless, the kind of indifference that cuts slower, deeper. I tried to focus on the little things, the clinking of silverware, the smell of baked apples, the flicker of candlelight dancing across the glasses, but underneath all that shimmer, I could feel something missing. The air itself felt staged. Marianne refilled everyone's wine, her movements sharp and efficient, as if the rhythm of control kept her safe. Across the table, Travis smiled at one of her comments, something about the new office renovation, and kissed her hand dramatically. Everyone laughed. It was a good scene. Perfect lighting, perfect timing. I watched them, not with envy, but with a kind of quiet disbelief. How easily they seemed to belong to each other, to this life. I'd been away long enough to realize that belonging was its own kind of privilege when Marianne's gaze flicked to me again. She asked if I was still doing that flying thing. I said yes, just teaching now. She nodded, a practiced half-smile. Oh, that's nice. Something stable for once. Her words hit soft, but they landed heavy. Stable, as if motion was a flaw. As if all those nights in the air, all the things I'd seen, could be boiled down to instability. Dad cleared his throat, the sound brief but grounding, like a small defense. I caught his eye again and forced a smile. He gave one back, the kind that said, I know, kid, I know. Dinner moved on. The kids giggled over dessert. Travis told a story about a client who mistook him for someone famous. Everyone laughed again. I laughed too. On cue. I reached for my glass of wine and caught the faint reflection of myself in the window. The woman staring back didn't look tired. She looked misplaced, like a guest who'd stayed too long at a party meant for someone else. When Marianne stood to clear the plates, I noticed her glance, quick, efficient, making sure everything looked right before she disappeared into the kitchen. That's when I understood. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't see me anymore. Not as the person I'd been, not as the one I'd become. I'd turned invisible somewhere along the way. The thought didn't bring anger, just a quiet ache that sat somewhere between my ribs. I looked down at my wrist. The old pilot's watch was still ticking, faintly, almost stubbornly. The second hand trembled, slightly offbeat, like it was keeping time in a rhythm the rest of the world no longer followed. I pressed my thumb to the glass face, the metal cold against my skin. Somewhere beyond the walls, I could hear the faint howl of the wind moving across the hills. It reminded me of nights in the air, those hours when silence was both my companion and my shield. Inside, laughter rose again, warm and untroubled. I let it wash over me without joining in, then leaned back, watching the candlelight flicker across the rim of my wine glass. For a brief second, the reflection looked like fire on water, beautiful, but unstable. That's when it hit me. This wasn't my place anymore. Maybe it never had been. I sat there, still and quiet, as the clock in the hallway began to chime. The sound stretched through the house, soft and deliberate, each note reminding me of how long I'd been standing still. By the time it reached 11:55, the second hand on my watch had stopped completely. I didn't move to fix it. I just sat there, staring at the frozen dial, realizing that somewhere between their laughter and my silence, I'd stopped keeping time with this family a long time ago. Night settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The laughter from dinner had faded into the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak of old wood, every sigh of wind against the glass. Upstairs, the last footsteps had gone still. I sat alone in the guest room, a single lamp glowing beside me, its light falling soft against the frost on the windowpane. The house smelled of pine and spice, a little too perfect, as if the air itself didn't belong to me anymore. On the arm of the chair, my jacket lay folded, heavy with something I'd been trying not to think about since I arrived. Inside the front pocket was an envelope, pale yellow, creased at the edges, stamped with the seal of the Department of the Air National Guard. I'd carried it with me for 2 weeks, unopened. Sometimes I told myself I'd lost it, other times that I'd forgotten. The truth was simpler. I was afraid to know what it asked of me. I picked it up now, running my thumb along the edge. The paper was cool against my skin. My name, handwritten, precise, sat above the words personal and immediate. My pulse caught at that word. Immediate. It had been a long time since anything in my life felt that way. I hesitated. I knew the letter was a summons before I even broke the seal. They never reached out unless something serious had happened. Some storm no one else wanted to fly into. Some fire no one else could reach. But fear wasn't the reason I hadn't opened it. Not really. I wasn't scared of flying into a storm. I was scared of repeating one. 3 years ago, Alaska had swallowed part of my life whole. It was supposed to be a routine rescue, bring home a team of mountaineers trapped in a blizzard. I made the call to land when the winds were already turning. Jason, my co-pilot, argued against it, but I told him we could do it. We were trained for worse. We touched down in near zero visibility. The snow came sideways, slamming the windshield until everything was white. Then came the jolt, the scream of metal against rock, and the sound I still hear when the nights get too quiet. The snap of the rotor, the rush of air, the voice in my headset. Mayday. Bird 2 down. Repeat. Then static. When the radio went dead, I sat there frozen, waiting for the world to move again. Jason didn't. They told me later that the rotor caught his harness. They said it wasn't my fault. But every time I close my eyes, I still see the shape of his hand reaching for the latch, just a second too late. After that, I stopped believing in instinct. I filed the papers, stepped down from active duty, told everyone I was taking a break. But the truth was, I didn't trust myself to fly when someone else's life depended on it. Teaching felt safer, controlled skies, calm students, no storms to test me. And yet, here was the letter, proof that the world hadn't forgotten my name, even if I'd tried to. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. The sound of tearing paper was louder than I expected. The words were printed in black, stark and clean. Stormbird 6, report to base Oro 600 for Operation Wildfire Rescue. My old call sign. I hadn't heard it spoken in years. It hit harder than I wanted it to. Stormbird, the name they gave me after Alaska, because I was the one who flew back into the snow when everyone else turned away. They said it like a badge of honor. I wore it like a scar. My throat tightened. I folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it flat against my chest, as if I could crush the fear before it grew. Then I shoved it into my jacket pocket, the same way I used to pack pain into small, invisible spaces. Tidy, out of sight. I leaned back in the chair. Through the window, the world outside was still, covered in frost and moonlight. A street lamp down the road cast its glow through the glass, forming a faint pattern on the wooden table beside me. 2 streaks of light crossed in the middle, forming something that almost looked like wings. For a second, I laughed under my breath. Maybe it was a sign, or maybe just coincidence. Either way, it felt like the kind of reminder I couldn't ignore forever. A sound behind me broke the stillness. Footsteps, slow and steady. I turned. My father stood in the doorway, half-shadowed, wearing the same expression he'd had my whole life. A man who'd seen more than he ever said. His voice came quiet, low, the way it used to when I was a kid, and he didn't want to wake the house. That a letter from the guard? I didn't answer. He stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his weight. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "If you don't want to fly anymore, don't do it out of duty." He paused, the kind of pause that carries years inside it. But if there's something you haven't finished, don't let it keep you heavy. I stared at him, caught between guilt and gratitude. Somehow, I knew he'd been waiting for this moment, maybe even expecting it. There was no lecture, no push, just the quiet permission I didn't know I'd been needing. When he left, the door closed without a sound. I sat there for a long while, tracing the faint lines of light on the table, the shape of those accidental wings. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the windows like breath. The letter lay heavy in my pocket, alive with the weight of choice. It was almost midnight when I finally stood, turned off the lamp, and let the room fall dark. The reflection in the window stared back, a face I barely recognized, a pair of eyes that still knew the sky even when the ground felt safer. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. By the next evening, the house had found its rhythm again. Laughter rose and fell through the rooms, plates clinked, the smell of roast and cinnamon still hanging in the air. Marianne thrived in that kind of noise. She moved through it like a conductor, refilling glasses, fixing a napkin's fold, adjusting the lighting just enough to flatter everyone's reflection. She loved order disguised as joy, and everyone followed her lead. After dessert, she announced a game, clapping her hands like a teacher rallying her students. "A family quiz," she said. Old memories, fun questions, no pressure. But with Marianne, there was always pressure. It just came wrapped in charm. We gathered around the table again. The red wine caught the light, deep and glossy, like liquid glass. Someone dimmed the chandelier. The air turned soft, humming with warmth and expectation. The first few rounds were harmless. Favorite childhood Christmas gifts, Dad's worst haircut, The year Uncle Dale burned the turkey. There was laughter, good-natured teasing, the kind of nostalgia that always favored the storytellers. Marianne kept score in a little notepad, her handwriting looping perfectly across the page. Then she leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting with something sharper. She smiled, the kind of smile that said she was about to turn the game into something else entirely. "Final question," she said, lifting her glass. "Who in this family made Mom the proudest?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone shifted slightly, glancing at one another, waiting to see who would speak first. Aunt Clara said, "Marianne, of course, because she kept Mom's traditions alive." Someone else joked that Travis deserved credit for winning another big case this month. Even Dad chuckled softly. Then, inevitably, the attention swung toward me. Marianne tilted her head, chin propped on her hand. That familiar tone crept into her voice, sweet as sugar, but sharp underneath. "Does our pilot sister have a story that doesn't involve helicopters or classified adventures?" The laughter came fast, too fast. It filled the space before I could even breathe. I took a sip of wine, letting the sting of it slow me down. Then I said, steady and low, "Mom used to tell me that not every good thing needs a certificate." The sound of laughter cut clean off. The silence that followed was almost physical. You could feel it move across the room, heavy and unsure. Marianne's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed just a little. Not in anger, but in calculation, like she was trying to read a language she'd never bothered to learn. Travis cleared his throat and tried to smooth it over, telling a story about a client with a funny accent, but it didn't land. The warmth had gone out of the room, replaced by a quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface. I sat back, tracing the rim of my wineglass, pretending not to notice how the mood had shifted. The candle flame wavered slightly, its reflection trembling in the glass. Then my phone buzzed, a faint vibration against the table, small but sharp enough to cut through the silence. I froze. I reached for it quickly, pretending to check a message, but the code on the screen made my stomach tighten. A string of digits I knew by heart, the kind that only came from one place. I set my glass down, murmured an excuse, and slipped into the hallway. The old floorboards creaked under my feet. I stepped near the front window, where the signal came through strongest, and lifted the phone to my ear. Static hissed through, followed by a clipped voice wrapped in radio distortion. "Confirm position. Mission active, 0600. Then silence. I ended the transmission, heart thudding in my chest. My breath fogged the cold glass of the window. Snow had begun to fall outside, slow, deliberate flakes catching the porch light as they drifted down. I stood there a few seconds longer, letting the cold steady me. Then I slipped the phone into my pocket and went back to the dining room. The laughter had returned, but it was thinner now, forced. Marianne's eyes found mine as soon as I walked in. I could tell she'd noticed how long I'd been gone. Her smile was polite, but her gaze lingered, curious and suspicious all at once. "Your little teaching job seems to have a lot of secrets," she said. The words wrapped in velvet, but meant to sting. I kept my tone even. Some things worth doing can't always be explained. A few people chuckled awkwardly. The moment should have ended there. It almost did. But Marianne couldn't resist the last word. She gave that small, dismissive laugh that always made her look like the heroine of her own joke. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're still playing soldier. We're adults now, Loretta." The room erupted in laughter again. Loud, hollow. I didn't join them. I just looked toward the window, outside. The snow had thickened, layering over the glass, muting the sounds of the house. The world beyond it looked peaceful in a way this room never would. The light from the chandelier flickered, catching on the face of my watch. For a moment I thought it was just a trick of reflection, but then I saw the second hand had stopped. The watch had been Mom's gift to me when I left home the first time. It had survived years of storms, of deployments, of endless nights above clouds and below stars. It had never stopped, until now. I lifted my wrist closer, staring at the frozen dial. The hand stood still at 11:55, the faintest tick trying and failing to move forward. Around me, the laughter carried on. The sound felt miles away. I set my wine down, the glass leaving a faint ring on the polished wood. My reflection stared back from its surface, blurred. distorted by candlelight. Upstairs. I could hear the old clock chime the hour. Each note sounded slower than the last. Stretching into the quiet, I told myself it was just coincidence, that clocks stop all the time. But a part of me knew better. Something in my world had stopped keeping time with theirs a long time ago. That night, the snow kept falling. The laughter faded, and I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that stillness press down. Like the air before a storm. The dinner stretched longer than it should have. The wine was good, the laughter full, the kind that sounded warm enough to pass for love. I smiled when everyone else did. Spoke only when spoken to. After a while, I stopped tasting the food. Every word around that table was like polished glass, bright, delicate, and just sharp enough to draw blood if you weren't careful. They traded stories of promotions, ski resorts, and newly renovated kitchens. Every success had a punchline. Every anecdote a well-rehearsed pause for applause. I listened from my chair at the end of the table, nodding along like an understudy in a play I hadn't auditioned for. When it circled back to me, I tried to make my voice steady. I told them about the flight classes I ran in Missoula. Kids from rough neighborhoods learning to trust their hands, their focus, the open sky. For a brief moment, I almost forgot who I was talking to. Then Marianne's voice cut clean through the air. Just like when Mom got sick. Right? You were off teaching one of those good deeds classes instead of being there. The room froze. Forks stopped midair. Her tone was too light to be open cruelty, too soft to call her out on it. That was her gift. She could draw blood with a whisper. The sound around me faded, replaced by the slow pounding of my own heart. I said, quiet but clear. I was flying that day. Flying where? She asked. Her voice thinner now, cold around the edges, in a blizzard. Someone needed help. No one spoke, but I could feel the shift. That familiar invisible judgment filled the room, the one that always came when duty collided with what they called family. To them, every mission was just an excuse not to show up. Dad set down his glass. He looked at the table, then at me, his voice calm, heavy with memory. Your mother was proud of you, he said. Even if she didn't get the chance to tell you. For a second, no one breathed. Marianne's jaw tightened. The smile she tried to force back onto her face didn't reach her eyes. To anyone else it might have looked gracious. To me, it looked like surrender laced with resentment. The candle beside her flickered hard when a gust of wind hit the window. The flame bent sideways, throwing shadows across her face. For a heartbeat, her expression looked naked, hurt, jealous, and something close to regret. Dinner carried on, technically, but it wasn't the same. Every sentence felt forced, every laugh too short. I could feel the chill spreading through the room like frost across glass. I wanted to stand, to leave quietly, but she wasn't done. You've always been good at leaving, Marianne said. Parties, holidays, everything. It's kind of your trademark. The knife and fork in my hands felt heavier than they should have. I placed them down carefully. The sound of metal on china louder than it needed to be. I didn't answer her. There was nothing left to say. The air felt thinner as I stepped out of the room. Behind me, the conversation started up again, forced and clumsy. Someone laughed too loud. The sound followed me into the hallway, then died as the door closed behind me. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. The wind was dry and sharp, carrying the scent of snow and something metallic. I crossed the yard to the detached garage, the same one Dad built when I was a kid, and opened the side door. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, dust and cold air greeted me. The single bulb above the workbench was burned out, so I used the small flashlight from my pocket. Its beam cut through the darkness and landed on the old Jeep sitting under a sheet. Mom's Jeep. The same one she'd driven to every air show, every base visit, every time she told me to chase something bigger than comfort. I pulled the sheet back. The smell of old leather and oil rose up, familiar and grounding. When I ran my fingers along the cracked steering wheel, a memory slipped through. Mom sitting in that very seat, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her voice calm over the hum of an engine. If you choose the sky, she'd said once, you have to accept the cold. Freedom always comes with weather. I leaned back, letting the flashlight rest on the dash. The light bounced off the windshield, creating two perfect streaks, one to the left, one to the right. For a second, They looked like wings. I almost laughed. It felt like the kind of symbolism my mother would have loved. The wind whistled through the crack in the garage door. Somewhere in the dark, an old radio sat on the shelf. I twisted the dial until static filled the air, followed by a few seconds of a tune I hadn't heard since childhood. Mom's favorite song, soft, crackling through time. The melody hung there like breath in cold air. I didn't realize I wasn't alone until I heard the door again. The creak was quiet but distinct, the kind that makes your spine straighten before your mind catches up. I turned the flashlight. It was Travis. He stood just inside the doorway, his face pale against the dim light, eyes searching mine. There was something careful about his posture, like he'd been rehearsing this moment. He took a breath. Then, slowly, he lifted his phone, the screen glowing blue. "I just spoke to someone I used to serve with," he said. "They told me about a pilot, Stormbird, a woman who pulled out an entire fire crew from Glacier Park last winter. My brother was one of them. He said he never forgot the voice in the radio, said it was calm, even when everything else was burning down." I didn't move. The cold air between us seemed to hum. He looked straight at me. "That was you, wasn't it?" The words hung there. I didn't confirm or deny. Instead, I asked quietly, "If I said yes, would you believe me?" He nodded once. "Yeah, I already do. I just don't understand why you never told anyone. Because if I say it out loud, it stops being mine." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or understanding. It was the first time that night someone looked at me without pity or pretense. He slipped his phone into his pocket, nodded once more, and said softly, "Thank you. Not everyone's brave enough to do the right thing without needing to be seen." When he left, the wind filled the silence he'd left behind. I sat there, the radio still whispering in the background, my breath visible in the cold. For the first time in years, the air around me felt open. Somewhere between the static and the song, I realized that maybe being seen wasn't about being noticed. It was about finally being understood. The garage was still half dark when I woke. The yellow light above the workbench hummed faintly, casting long, soft shadows across the dust. The air smelled like oil, cold metal, and memory. I sat there with the letter in my hands again, the one I had folded and refolded until the edges were soft. Sushi 600. Wyoming. Wildfire Rescue. The words stared back at me, so clean and absolute they almost pulsed. I traced them with my thumb, feeling their weight press deeper into my chest. Wyoming meant snowfields, mountains, radio calls that might cut out mid-sentence. It meant a storm strong enough to swallow sound, and everything else with it. I didn't know if I could do it again. I didn't know if I could fly into another whiteout without hearing Jason's voice on the radio, or seeing the light fade from a cockpit that once felt like home. But I knew one thing. Hiding from it any longer would mean losing the last piece of myself that still believed I was capable of more than fear. The light above me flickered once. I stood, folded the letter neatly, and slipped it into my jacket. My gear bag was still half-packed from my last civilian flight lesson. I threw in gloves, a thermal undershirt, my old headset, each motion mechanical, precise, practiced. The movements felt like muscle memory, waking up after a long sleep. When I turned toward the doorway, I heard it, the slow, familiar rhythm of my father's footsteps. He'd always walked as though he was measuring every step. "You're leaving," he said quietly from the shadow of the hallway. I kept packing, not because I didn't want to answer, but because I was afraid that if I stopped moving, I wouldn't start again. "I have to go," I said. "There are people waiting." He didn't argue. He just stood there for a long moment, his silhouette framed by the dull yellow light. Then he nodded, his eyes soft but tired. "Be careful, Loretta." I turned to face him. The look on his face, part pride, part fear, was something I hadn't seen since the day I first shipped out. He didn't try to stop me then either. He knew better than anyone that you can't hold back someone who belongs to the sky. I wanted to say something about how much I'd missed him, or how I wished Mom could see this, but the words stuck somewhere behind my ribs, so I just nodded. It was enough. He left the door open behind him. The wind crept in, brushing against the old tarp that covered Mom's Jeep. I watched it flutter like a flag in the half-light. When I finally stepped into the hallway, my bag slung over one shoulder. Marianne was standing there. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her robe pulled tight, even half asleep. She managed to look composed, like the world was a mirror she had to hold steady. "You always know when to play the hero, don't you?" she said. Her tone was steady, but her eyes gave her away, something flickering behind them, something she didn't want me to see. I stopped a few feet from her. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just trying not to be a coward." Her arms dropped to her sides. For once, she didn't have a comeback ready. The space between us filled with things we'd never said: regret, pride, maybe even a trace of love, buried under years of misunderstanding. I stepped past her toward the door. She stayed there, silent, watching me go. The cold outside hit hard and fast. I climbed into my truck, turned the key, and watched the headlights carve through the dark. The sky was black and wide, full of unseen wind. Snow had already started falling again, soft but relentless. As the tires crunched over the frozen driveway, I glanced back once. Through the window, I saw my father standing at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing, and Marianne in the hallway, her face pale in the light. Neither of them waved, but they didn't need to. The road wound through the mountains, a silver thread cutting between walls of white. The heater struggled to keep up. My breath fogged the glass. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting against the envelope tucked inside my jacket, as if feeling it there would make what waited ahead more real. The radio murmured through static, weather reports, highway advisories, bits of Christmas music bleeding through distant frequencies. Then, buried in the noise, came the voice of a news anchor. A Category 4 winter storm is now moving across northern Wyoming. Emergency crews are preparing for possible rescues. I turned the volume up. Air units have been placed on standby. The Air National Guard has issued a call for additional support. I switched it off. I didn't need the reminder. I was already driving toward it. Outside, the snow thickened. My headlights caught it swirling in 1,000 directions, each flake tumbling like static through the night. It was beautiful, and cruel, and familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Somewhere along the ridge, I pulled over for a moment, stepping out into the cold. The silence was almost holy, the kind of silence that holds the weight of everything you can't say. I looked up at the sky, gray, endless, and whispered the words I hadn't been able to say to anyone. "Don't let me fail again." The wind carried it off before I even heard my own voice. Back at the house, the hours dragged slow. Marianne sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea. The clock ticked loud in the stillness. Travis sat across from her, elbows on his knees, staring into nothing. "You know," he said softly, "my brother's still alive because of her." Marianne didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the doorway, where I had stood only an hour earlier. The robe around her shoulders looked too thin now. Her hands clenched too tight. She reached into the pocket of that robe, feeling something crumpled there. When she pulled it out, she froze. It was the letter, the one I'd left on the hallway table without realizing. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The official header, the seal, the words Stormbird 6, report to base 0600 for Operation Wildfire Rescue. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she read it again, slower this time, until the truth finally settled. I wasn't just a flight instructor playing at nostalgia. I'd never really stopped serving. Travis watched her silently. She pressed the paper flat on the table, smoothing out every crease like she could erase what it meant. The sound of the wind outside filled the silence between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, cracked open at the edges. "I didn't know." He nodded. "Now you do." She stared at the letter a little longer, then folded it carefully, holding it against her chest. Her reflection caught in the kitchen window, eyes red, mouth tight. The snow outside had turned heavy. It covered the porch, the trees, the world beyond the glass, and somewhere out there, far past the line of mountains. My headlights were the only moving light in a white world that had no mercy for hesitation. The engine hummed steady. The road wound on. For the first time in years, I didn't feel lost. I was heading back into the storm. The storm had already started by the time I reached the ridge. Snow came sideways, thick and relentless, the kind that erased distance and direction in the same breath. The Jeep rattled beneath me as I climbed higher, the old engine protesting against the cold. Mom's Jeep had never failed me before, and I whispered a silent promise to her memory that it wouldn't start tonight. The headlights pushed into the whiteout, their beams swallowed within feet. Somewhere ahead, at the edge of Wyoming, a rescue team was stranded, waiting for air support that hadn't arrived. The radio crackled through static, half-eaten by interference. Then a voice came through, cutting the air in broken pieces. Stormbird 6. Confirm altitude. Wind speed 50 knots. Proceed at own risk. Proceed at own risk. The phrase echoed like an old ghost. I'd heard it before, back in Alaska, before everything went wrong. But this time, it didn't tighten my chest. It grounded me. I tightened my grip on the stick, glanced once at the photo taped to my dash, a younger me standing next to a rescue chopper, smiling despite the cold, and whispered, "Copy that." Proceeding. The wind slammed against the fuselage like a living thing when I finally got airborne. Ice crawled across the windshield in thin white veins. The rotor groaned under the weight of frozen air, and the world below turned into a blur of gray ridges and flashing snow. Visibility near zero. No landmarks, no lights. Just instinct, just memory. Every muscle in my body remembered the terrain. The bends in the mountain, the dark line of trees along the river valley, the faint shimmer where ice met open water. I flew by feel, trusting what my eyes couldn't give me. Over the radio, control came back through the storm, their voices straining through static. Stormbird 6, abort. Too risky. Negative. Control. We don't leave people behind. The silence that followed was my only approval. I adjusted the trim, kept the nose steady. Beneath me, a valley opened like a wound, the snow swirling through it in tight spirals. Then, faintly, I saw it. A flicker of orange against all the white. A fire, or what was left of one. I descended fast. The altimeter spun. The helicopter shuddered as wind punched the side hard enough to rattle my teeth. I could feel the rotor strain, the engine groaning as it fought the cold. Hold together, I muttered. Just a little longer. As I dropped closer, shapes began to emerge. 5, maybe 6 figures huddled near a burning flare. They were waving, the signal weak but visible through the snow. My heart kicked once, hard. I was close enough now to hear the gusts of wind slicing past the blades, to smell the faint sting of smoke bleeding into the air. Hold tight, I'm coming in. I said it out loud, partly for them, partly for myself. The landing was chaos. The chopper bounced hard, skidding a few feet before the skids caught on ice. I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I left the engine running, threw open the side door, and stepped into the storm. The air was pure noise, wind howling, snow biting at my face, the metallic scream of the rotor overhead. I moved fast, pulling each firefighter toward the open hatch, their suits crusted with frost, their faces white and raw, one by one. I dragged them inside until the last man stumbled forward, limping, his helmet cracked. I shoved him through and climbed in after, slamming the door shut against the wind. That's when I saw it, the smoke curling from the engine. We were out of time. I lifted off anyway, pulling hard on the collective. The helicopter clawed into the air, the controls fighting me with every inch. The sound of metal on metal filled the cockpit. Stormbird 6. This is Control. Do you copy? Loud and clear. We've got everyone. The snow blurred everything again, the horizon vanishing into a wall of white. I couldn't tell sky from ground anymore. Then the vibration changed, heavier, slower. A warning light flashed red. The rotor wasn't going to hold. Hold tight, we're not losing anyone tonight, I shouted into the mic, voice breaking through static. At the same time, hundreds of miles away, my family sat in the living room, the storm pressing against their windows like an animal trying to get in. Marianne sat at the edge of the couch, both hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. Her knuckles were white. Travis stood by the window, his reflection ghosted against the glass, watching the snow pile up along the porch. My father sat near the radio, the emergency frequency crackling through the static. Stormbird 6, en route. Visibility near zero. The room went still, Marianne whispered, barely audible. She really went. Travis turned from the window, his voice low but steady. She always goes, but she's never left anyone behind. The fire popped in the hearth. The sound filled the silence that followed. Then the radio burst alive again, static first, then a rush of rotor noise, and finally, my voice breaking through, thin but clear. Hold tight! We're not losing anyone tonight, Marianne gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling faster than she could stop them. Travis reached for her, but she stepped forward instead, standing closer to the sound like she could will me home. My father turned away, hiding the tremor in his jaw. Now you understand, Travis said softly. She doesn't need applause. She just needs to fly. Out there, the storm reached its peak. The rotor screamed. The altitude gauge spun down. The warning alarms bled together into a single, piercing tone. I could see the landing site, a patch of flattened snow. Not wide enough, not level enough, but it was all we had. The rotor hit something, jolting the entire airframe. I fought the controls, trying to steady it, but the machine tilted, one skid catching the ground. The world lurched sideways. The last thing I saw was the mountain, a white wall rising up to meet me. Stormbird 6. Mayday, engine out. Coordinates transmitting. Safe souls. Returning home. The radio went dead. In the house. The words echoed through the static, then vanished. The screen on the radio went black, for a full 10 seconds. No one breathed. Then Marianne sank to her knees. She said she got them. She whispered through sobs. She said safe souls. That means she saved them. Travis knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her as her body shook. My father stayed by the fire, staring at the embers. The reflection of the flames caught the brass insignia sitting on the mantel, the one he'd kept from his own years in the Air Force. The heat made it glow, the small wings glinting gold, almost alive. The snow kept falling outside, relentless and endless. Inside, the only sound left was the hum of the fire, the soft echo of a call sign fading into silence. And for the first time in that house, no one said a word. The storm was alive. It screamed and clawed at the helicopter as if trying to peel it open. Every sound in the cockpit blended into one, the low growl of the engine, the slicing whip of the rotor blades, the sharp beeping of dying instruments. The world outside had vanished into white. No horizon, no sky, no ground, just movement and faith. The radar had gone dark 10 minutes ago. The navigation display blinked once, then flatlined, leaving nothing but static. The radio hissed, spitting broken words through the noise. Stormbird 6. Control calling. Abort mission. Repeat. Abort. Visibility. 0. My hands tightened around the cyclic. My voice came out calm, lower than my heartbeat. Negative. Control. We don't leave anyone behind. The wind hit again, harder this time, tilting the chopper to one side. I fought it back, every muscle remembering what fear felt like and choosing to ignore it. The windshield shimmered with a thin layer of ice. My breath fogged the glass faster than the defroster could clear it. Then, through the blur of white, a flicker, just a pulse of orange light in the distance. A fire. Weak, but alive. I banked toward it. The gusts shoved me like a giant hand. The machine shuddered. Warning lights flared red across the console. I could smell something burning, oil, maybe wiring. But below, I saw them. 3 shapes huddled together in the snow, half covered, waving their arms against the wind. Hang on, I whispered, though they couldn't hear me. I dropped altitude, the rotor screaming as we cut through air so dense it felt solid. The skids hit the ground with a brutal jolt. For a moment I thought we'd roll, but the left side held. I unbuckled, kicked the door open, and jumped into the storm. The cold hit like a wall. I couldn't breathe. The wind sliced at my skin, finding every gap in my flight suit. My boots sank into snow up to my shins. The men were 20 feet away. Might as well have been a mile. Move, I told myself, one at a time. The first man's eyes were wide, glazed with shock. I grabbed him by the harness, pulled him toward the chopper, each step a battle against the wind. When he was inside, I turned back for the others. The second man stumbled forward on his own. The third, he didn't move at all. He was down, half buried, his hand frozen around a radio. I dropped beside him, grabbed the strap of his jacket, and pulled. He didn't budge. I looked up. The snow was closing around us, the helicopter barely visible through the white curtain. You don't get to die here? I muttered, voice shaking with effort. I hooked the rescue line to my belt and the other end to him, digging my boots into the ice. The rotor's downdraft whipped snow into a blinding cyclone. My cheeks stung, my fingers burned. Every breath was a blade. One more pull, just one. His body shifted, heavy but not lifeless. I hauled him up with everything left in me. My shoulder screamed. The rope cut into my gloves. And then, movement. We slid forward together until the wind pushed us both against the landing gear. Hands reached out from the cabin, one of the others, pulling him in. I climbed after, slamming the door shut behind us. All souls accounted for. Barely. The radio spat again. Stormbird 6, control, come in! I grabbed the mic, still catching my breath. Copy, control, Stormbird 6, outbound with survivors. I lifted off, the engine roaring in protest. The weight of the storm pressed against us, invisible but crushing. Every second, the wind changed direction, throwing us sideways, stealing lift. Come on, I whispered. Just give me altitude. We climbed 50 feet, 100. The snow thinned for a moment, revealing the jagged face of the mountain ahead. Then came the sound, metal against rock, a scream through the air. The rotor hit a frozen ridge. The entire helicopter jerked, tilted violently. The alarms blared again, red lights flashing across the cabin. The men behind me yelled, gripping the seats. I tried to steady the stick, but the controls fought me. The helicopter rolled left, nose dropping. I pushed back with everything I had. Stormbird 6, Mayday, engine out. Coordinates transmitting. Safe souls, returning home. The radio sparked once, then went silent. The last thing I saw through the windshield was a swirl of white swallowing everything. The mountain, the fire, the sky. Then nothing. Miles away, the storm had reached Montana. The windows of my sister's house rattled against the wind. The world outside was buried in white silence. In the living room, the radio on the fireplace crackled to life, its signal weak but cutting through the storm. Stormbird 6, Mayday, engine out, safe souls, returning home. The words came and went like whispers between gusts. Marianne dropped the mug in her hands. Coffee splashed across the floor as she covered her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Travis moved first, rushing to the radio, turning the dial even though the signal was already gone. My father stood behind them, his posture straight, every line of his face carved from restraint. He stared at the window for a long time before raising his hand in a small, precise motion. The same salute he'd given to fallen comrades decades before. Marianne fell to her knees. The sound that came from her, not quite a sob, not quite a breath. She said, safe souls. She whispered, that means she got them out. Travis knelt beside her, pulling her close. Neither spoke. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the porch light, erasing the driveway, the world shrinking to nothing but wind and white. Inside, the fire burned low. Its reflection flickered against the polished brass insignia resting on the mantel. My father's old Air Force wings. The light caught them just right, and for a moment, they gleamed bright gold, as if alive. The radio stayed silent after that. No updates, no voice, just the hum of static and the slow crack of burning wood. For nearly an hour, no one moved. Then the phone rang. Travis answered. His voice trembled as he listened. When he hung up, he didn't speak right away. He just looked toward Marianne, tears cutting clean lines down his face. They found her, he said finally. All of them, alive. Marianne let out a sound somewhere between a cry and a laugh. She pressed her hands to her face, shaking. My father exhaled deeply, the kind of breath that comes after holding something for too long. No one said another word. They didn't have to. For the first time, the silence in that house wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Outside, the storm began to slow. The wind softened, the snow easing to a gentle drift. The world was still, and for once, stillness didn't mean fear. Far above the mountains, the clouds parted for a second, letting through a thin streak of red light, just enough to touch the snow and make it shine. It looked, from a distance, like a wing gliding through the storm. 2 days passed before I made it back to Helena. The storm had broken, but the cold hadn't. It clung to everything, the sky, the ground, my bones. The Jeep rolled into the driveway, slow and silent, its tires crunching over the ice. Through the window, I could see the faint flicker of the living room fire. My uniform was torn at the sleeve, one hand wrapped in bandages that were already coming loose. My lips were split from the wind, my eyes raw from the brightness of snow and sleepless hours. I didn't care. I was standing. That was enough. When I opened the door, The same smell that had greeted me days before drifted through the air: pine, cinnamon, and something sweet like maple. But this time, it didn't sting. This time, it felt earned. The house was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet I remembered before. Silence in this place meant judgment, measured breaths waiting for someone to speak first. Now, it was full, heavy with something closer to reverence. Everyone was there. My father stood by the window, his posture straight, his hand resting on the mantel like an anchor. Marianne was seated on the couch, her eyes red, her shoulders drawn tight. Travis stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other clenched in his pocket. When I stepped in, all three of them rose. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the whisper of snow sliding off the roof outside. My father moved first. He crossed the room slowly, every step measured. When he stopped in front of me, he didn't say a word, just nodded once. The same kind of nod he'd given me when I left for training the very first time. A soldier's acknowledgement, not of rank, but of understanding. Behind him, Travis cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. "They've been broadcasting your call sign all over the state," he said quietly. "The news, the radio, everywhere. They're calling it the miracle in the storm." I didn't know how to respond to that. I hadn't done it for the story. I never had. I just wanted to make sure they made it home. But hearing those words, the miracle in the storm, made something in my chest tighten and release at the same time. Then Marianne stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she reached for me, her eyes glassy and unsure. For a moment, I thought she might stop halfway, retreat back into the distance we'd always lived with. But she didn't. Her voice came soft, uneven. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why did you let me think?" I met her gaze, steady but gentle. "Because you never asked." The words came out quiet, but they landed with weight. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Marianne's face crumpled. She closed the distance between us and wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't careful or polite like our old hugs used to be. It was desperate, real, human. Her body shook against mine as she sobbed into my shoulder, the sound raw and unguarded. I held her back, feeling years of resentment loosen like thawing ice. Travis turned away, pretending to tend to the fire, but I saw his hand swipe quickly at his eyes. There were no apologies, no speeches, just warmth, the kind that speaks louder than words ever could. My father disappeared down the hall for a moment, then returned holding a small velvet box wrapped in faded blue cloth. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, revealing the silver wings inside. "My mother's. She kept these from her Air Force days," he said, voice low and gravelly. "She wanted you to have them someday, not for glory, for direction, so you'd never forget which way was home." He placed the box in my hands. The metal was cool, smooth, heavier than I remembered. The firelight caught the polished surface, scattering it across the walls like fragments of stars. For a second, I saw her face in my mind, smiling the way she used to when I came home from base. Eyes bright and proud. It hit me how much of her had been there in that storm. The calm, the courage, the quiet conviction that some things are simply worth doing, no matter who's watching. My father rested his hand briefly on my shoulder. The gesture said everything his voice couldn't. Then he stepped back, his eyes glistening in the glow of the flames. Marianne sat down again, wiping her cheeks, her breathing uneven. She reached for a tissue but missed, still half laughing through tears. Her voice cracked as she looked at me. "Evan asked about you this morning. He wanted to know if you were scared." I smiled, the answer already waiting. Of course I was. Courage isn't about not being scared, it's doing it anyway. She nodded slowly, eyes falling to the silver wings resting in my palms. For a long time, none of us said anything. The only sound left was the quiet pop of burning wood and the faint whistle of wind outside. The room was warm now, almost too warm, the heat from the fire curling against my bandaged skin. Travis poured coffee for everyone, though no one really drank it. We sat there in a half circle, the fire between us, the past slowly softening around the edges. I caught my father watching the flames, his face flickering between shadow and light. He looked at peace for the first time in years. Marianne leaned into Travis, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and I realized the house felt different now. not because it had changed, but because we finally had. The firelight danced over the silver wings in my hand, and I turned them gently, letting the glow reflect on the ceiling. Two streaks of light curved upward, like a bird in flight. We stood there a while longer, my father, my sister, her husband, and me, drawn together not by words or blood or even forgiveness, but by a simple truth that had finally spoken for itself. The truth didn't shout, it didn't need to. It existed in the silence, in the steady heartbeat of the home, in the soft shimmer of metal catching light. As the fire burned low, the last flame licked across the wings one more time, and for a second, they looked alive, lifting from my hands, weightless, certain, free. We didn't say goodnight. We didn't need to. Some things, I'd learned, are meant to be understood in quiet. Christmas came again, 1 year later. The snow returned to Helena, blanketing the rooftops and hills in a soft, endless white, but the house didn't feel cold anymore. The warmth inside didn't come from decorations or preparation. It came from peace. The lights were softer this time, golden instead of glittering. No one worried about perfect centerpieces or color schemes. Marianne had baked simple cinnamon loaves, the kind Mom used to make, their scent filling the air with a sweetness that belonged to memory. Jazz played low from an old radio, the trumpet notes winding through laughter that didn't need to be loud to sound happy. The living room looked smaller now, not because anything had changed, but because everything finally fit. Travis sat on the floor near the coffee table, wrapping presents with paper covered in tiny silver wings. Across the room, Marianne was showing Evan how to fold paper cranes, her fingers moving gently, her voice patient, softer than I'd ever heard it. She didn't talk much about last Christmas. She didn't need to. The change in her wasn't dramatic, but it was real, steady and quiet. When helicopters flew overhead now, she always paused mid-sentence, looked up, and smiled to herself. She'd started volunteering with a program that supported military families, the kind that kept letters flowing and homes connected to the ones who served far away. Travis had built something too, a foundation named after me, though I'd begged him not to. The Stormbird Foundation, he'd called it. It funded rehab and counseling for injured rescue pilots. He said it wasn't for me, but for what people like me stood for. I believed him. Dad sat in his favorite armchair by the fire, the same place he always had. He didn't talk much anymore either, but he didn't have to. Every time our eyes met, I could read it there, the pride that didn't need to be spoken, the kind that ran deeper than words. His gaze followed the flames, calm and steady, and I thought he looked more at peace than I'd ever seen him. I stood by the window, watching the snow drift down in slow, lazy spirals. The world outside was quiet, blank, waiting. I could still hear, faintly, the sound of a helicopter somewhere in the distance, muffled but familiar. The sound didn't stir fear in me anymore. It felt like a heartbeat I shared with the sky. Then Evan came running into the room, his cheeks flushed pink from excitement. In his small hands, he held the silver wings, the same ones my father had given me, the ones that once belonged to Mom. He looked up at me, grinning, his breath quick from running. "Aunt Loretta," he said, "Mom told me I should hang this on the tree. It's your wings. But Mom said they belong to everyone you helped, too." For a second, I couldn't speak. I just nodded. "Go ahead," I said. He tiptoed carefully to the tree, stretching to reach the top branch. The lights twinkled around him as he hooked the small silver wings onto a thin strand near the star. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the metal caught the light, reflecting it outward, scattering it across the walls like a ripple of soft white fire. Marianne and Travis stopped what they were doing. Dad looked up from his chair. None of us said a word. We just watched as the wings shone against the dark green pine. Each tiny reflection, a spark of something that felt like memory and hope all at once. The room was still, except for the faint crackle of the fireplace and the jazz record skipping softly between songs. Outside, the helicopter's hum grew distant until it faded completely. In its place came a quiet so deep, it felt like the air itself was listening. I looked around at the faces I loved. Marianne with her head resting against Travis's shoulder. Dad leaning forward, his hands folded. Evan sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the wings he'd just hung. And for the first time, I felt it fully, the silence. Not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd known all my life, but the kind that speaks without sound, the kind that carries truth. I thought, silence is still a language. It just speaks through what we do instead of what we say. No one noticed when I smiled. It was small, private, meant only for me and the memory of every night I'd ever spent inside a storm. The camera in my mind drifted toward the window, where the snow continued to fall in patient waves. The light from the fireplace glowed against the glass, and for a second, it painted the reflection of those silver wings onto the white outside, two soft arcs shimmering on the snow, like something taking flight. The house behind me was full of small sounds, the rustle of paper, the clink of mugs, the low hum of laughter. Life, in all its quietness, had found a rhythm again. I turned back toward the tree one last time. The wings still caught the light, glimmering like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. Outside, a new gust of wind swept across the yard, carrying with it a faint echo, a distant whir of blades moving through the air, steady and sure. It felt like a greeting, a reminder. The world was calm again, but the sky would always belong to those who dared to lift off. As the snow fell and the camera panned upward in my mind's eye, the light from the tree blurred into the night, dissolving into the pale expanse of the sky. White above, white below, just a whisper of motion in between. And then, as if the world itself exhaled, the story faded into the quiet voice that had always carried it. Some heroes don't fly for glory. They fly so others can go home.